3:28.
Good morning or afternoon, depending upon where you live. I'm John Hagelin, the president of Maharishi International University. Welcome to today's seminar. I'm really glad you've been able to join us today here. We're broadcasting from the boardroom in the Argiro Student Center, the center of our campus. It's a beautiful, warm, and was sunny day today. And I hope everything is well with you, that everybody is safe and weathering the pandemic well. Today's talk concerns something very interesting, something that most of you are, the phenomenon that most of you are well familiar with, called in the literature the Maharishi Effect. But it's the long-range peace-promoting influence of groups of individuals experiencing pure consciousness, practicing Transcendental Meditation and its advanced programs. It's a very easy way to access that universal, expanded state of awareness. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about, first of all, what that is. That'll be a quick review, and how it works, which is one of the most puzzling and intriguing scientific questions of our time, I would say. It really touches on some very, very deep issues. If you can see the first slide, I assume you can. Pardon me, we'll call this, if you wish, the physics of social coherence. If you wish, a new science of peace. And as I go into this, I wanted to quickly introduce an organization that you may or may not be familiar with, but it really is worth pointing out. It's called the Global Union of Scientists for Peace. And it's a global union of scientists and Nobel laureates that are dedicated to the cause of peace, nuclear disarmament, and nonviolent solutions to conflict. At their incredible conference that took place in Ukraine last summer at this Global Peace Summit, the whole buzz surrounded upon what they now refer to as the brain-based approach to peace, which is what we're calling the collective practice of the TM program and its advanced techniques. And the way the Global Unit of Scientists for Peace, or GUSP.org, lays it out, and you can see this on that website, is it's basically a series of 5 sequential, very easy steps to understanding this brain-based approach to peace. Firstly, human behavior is linked to brain functioning. Well, obviously that is true. Everything we think, everything we say, everything we do depends entirely upon the functioning of the brain. Point number 2, that stress impairs the brain, and as a consequence, it negatively impacts behavior. Under stress, we see an activation of the fear center or amygdala. We see that the prefrontal cortex, the higher brain, shuts down as the brain goes into fight or flight mode. And this is a driving factor in violent and antisocial behavior. On a societal level, stress fuels crime and social violence. There's no mystery about that. And we are living in an epidemic of stress, not just now during the pandemic, but really for years. We've seen mounting stress, particularly in critical hotspots throughout the world. But the idea that societal stress fuels crime and social violence, this quote is taken from one of the leading journals on conflict resolution. The first stage in the emergence of war is mounting tensions, is mounting societal stress, political, ethnic, and religious tensions in critical hotspots throughout the world. These mounting tensions, if unchecked, frequently erupt into social conflict. So if we have societal stress and that fuels social violence, terrorism, crime, and war, what do you do about that? Well, most people in the world who are addressing conflict are working on reducing the stressors, which could be aggressive behavior from a neighboring country, threatening behavior, could be poverty, it could be a drought, could be a downturn. So all of these stressors bear upon human life, and we're familiar with these stressors, I'm sure, to some extent in our own lives. That's one approach, but it's very difficult. Changing an economy, changing the behavior of a neighboring country, Solution number two is to actually reduce the stress itself. Stress is something we physiologically store in our bodies, in our brain physiologies. So if there were a way to reduce stress, we'd see a reduction in crime and social violence. That's an empirical fact. We also know, if you're on this call, that TM reduces stress very, very effectively. It improves criminal behavior as a consequence. It improves individual behavior. Transcending deactivates the amygdala, the fear center, and it reactivates the prefrontal cortex, restoring balanced blood flow to the entire brain and restoring the higher brain function, which allows us the ability to think before we act. When it comes to overcoming acute stress, recent research funded by the Pentagon and carried out by the Veterans Administration in a major multi-million-dollar study found that TM was more effective at reducing severe stress, post-traumatic stress disorder in veterans and active duty service people, more effectively than the gold standard psychotherapeutic approach to addressing the problem of PTSD. So as a stress buster, transcending is the most powerful tool the nervous system possesses. It has also been shown now in at least 25 published studies that prison inmates who are in for violent crimes, once they learn Transcendental Meditation in the prison, and this has been a program that has been adopted, fortunately, by quite a few prisons today, they don't go back to prison. So we have experimental evidence to show that transcending reduces criminal behavior, and also, as we'll see, evidence that it can stop war and violence and terrorism in war-torn areas. So this is all fairly common sense. The final step of logic, and what the Global Union of Scientists for Peace calls the brain-based approach to peace, is this idea that group meditation, or meditation on a societal scale, reduces societal stress and thereby reduces crime and social violence. It's no great stretch of logic to believe that by reducing individual stress and reducing individual violence, that by reducing stress on a societal level, we're going to reduce social violence, including terrorism and war. But it is such a novel idea. And when it was first published in a very prestigious journal, the Yale Journal of Conflict Resolution, premier journal in the area of conflict, it created such a firestorm of interest and some skepticism. This is a very interesting and important subject, and I'm going to dive into it more deeply, including how it works. One of the key studies was a major national demonstration of this phenomenon when a group of 4,000 plus meditators gathered from around the world in Washington, D.C. in 1993, and a very public test of the hypothesis that collective meditation would reduce crime in what was at that point called the murder capital of the world. Washington, D.C. has changed a bit, but certainly back then it was a very crime-ridden city. And when this experiment was launched, the chief of police, who was one of the 27 scientists and the head of statistics at the police department of Washington, were members of the scientific panel that wrote the paper and approved the findings. At the beginning of the study, the chief of police went on television in Washington, D.C. and said, it's going to take 2 feet of snow here this summer in July and August to reduce crime by 25%, which was our predicted reduction based on 49 previous studies of this very same phenomenon. So he was skeptical. A little bit of skepticism is healthy, but that's the study that began. And during the shaded period, particularly the dark shaded period, during the month of July, essentially, the last 2 weeks of July, we had gathered by then the 4,000 people that we needed to produce a predictable effect on violence in Washington, D.C. And when the group got sufficiently large, based on previous studies, we knew the number of people required to produce a measurable effect. The crime plummeted in Washington, D.C., and the whole city was transformed. Now, I could quote crime statistics, and this chart actually shows a drop in violent crime, murder, homicide, that means, armed robbery, assault, and rape. That's called Part 1 violent crime, dropped markedly when the group arrived. But just in addition to the statistics, which were very significant, many lives were saved, the whole feeling in Washington was just radically transformed. I'd like to just quote the opening sentence of this editorial that was published in the Washington Post a week after the group arrived. This is written by renowned commentary editorialist Sally Quinn. What a difference a week makes. The Clinton administration appears to have revived. Well, what was wrong with the Clinton administration? It was their first 6 months in office. It was a Republican-controlled Senate. The partisanship at that time was more intense than at any time in US history, with the possible exception of today. So none of Clinton's cabinet members were even approved 6 months into his administration. If you remember that, there was no government. So the whole government, there were no cabinet ministers. So the government was in crisis. So anyway, what a difference a week makes. The Clinton administration appears to have revived. Washington has relaxed. But such a swift reversal of political fortune is not easy to account for. One may logically wonder whether Clinton really turned things around or if something else is going on. Somehow, as if magically from heaven, a calm has descended on this city. And I was there, and at the start of this whole thing, gunshots rang throughout the night. Sirens were so constant that it was difficult to sleep. But the whole thing just quieted down. It was an amazing transformation. In another experiment, we have a permanent group here at the home of Maharishi International University in our golden meditation domes. And during the years of 2006 to 2010, we had very large numbers in these domes on a daily basis. And those numbers were big enough to produce a predicted effect on crime across the entire country. And remarkably, that is exactly what was seen. The continuing trend of predicted crime, with seasonality built in because the summers are higher crime and the dead of winter is lower crime. But taking into account the seasonality, the red line shows what actually happened after those numbers became so large. The likelihood that this drop in crime during this period was just a statistical fluke is negligible, less than 1 part in 10 trillion. And this is a significant reduction in crime, almost a 30% reduction in crime. Thousands of murders were averted and so on. So this is a very real effect. And I'm going to return to that study at the end because it shows us something very interesting and very relevant if we're going to try to understand how, in fact, this all works. Another important study was the application in the Middle East to turn off the war, which was raging in Lebanon in 1985 or so. And during that time, a large group was assembled, but the numbers in that group would fluctuate up and down. And you looked at the effect of the group on reducing war violence in Lebanon. We saw an 80% reduction in war violence and war deaths in Lebanon when the numbers participating in the group were large. This is a very statistically significant study. And that study was repeated 7 times by different collaborations of scientists across the world. And they all had the same result. While the groups were in place, the violence in the Middle East dropped remarkably in progress towards peace. The negotiations went well. When the groups were disbanded, the negotiations inevitably fell apart. The peace treaties were torn up and the war would resume. So this is a highly statistically significant effect, as you can see. So this so-called brain-based approach to peace based on collective transcending is the most thoroughly vetted, most powerfully demonstrated approach to peace that has ever been studied in the history of social science. But I think a key question to any scientist is how? How does this work? I mean, look at this. We had these 7 large meditation assemblies. During each of them, there was a marked reduction of violence and war deaths in the Middle East. About 70 to 80% average reduction in the number of war deaths. Some of these make sense to an average person because the groups of meditators were embedded in the conflict, or at least relatively nearby, in Israel itself, or in Lebanon itself. But the other experiments seem almost nonsensical, because the groups involved that were creating the calming effect were as far away as Fairfield, Iowa, as Washington, D.C., as the Netherlands. So it's hard for people to imagine how a group of individuals in Fairfield, Iowa, in the Golden Domes, could create a measurable calming influence that would span the globe and reach the Middle East. I would tend to think most people would, and I do, find that a bit nonsensical, or at least non-commonsensical. So we're going to address that issue of how in the world this long-range influence of peace, long-range connection between people, how it could exist and how it works. Step one, clearly, we need a new model of social interaction. Right now, a human being's aggressive thoughts or peaceful thoughts are pretty much considered to be a phenomenon of the human brain, locked inside the human skull. We need to expand that notion and come up with an unlocalized model for social interaction, what a physicist would call a field model of consciousness and social interaction. This field concept works. The idea of the electromagnetic field, we have an influence from a long distance. This cell phone signal will travel to the tower 6 miles away. From there, it'll travel across the world. So we're used to fields. And fields fit the phenomenon pretty well. Any field, let's consider it the field of sound, the sound that's generated by a boombox. A boombox, all waves, including sound waves and light waves and radio waves, they all have the same behavior. If you have two sources or two loudspeakers in a typical boombox, and you happen to be playing monaural music, which means both speakers are functioning in synchrony with each other. And what happens is those two sound waves add up. They produce a combined wave, which is twice as tall as a single wave, but the power of a sound wave or a light wave or a radio wave, the power of a wave grows as the square of the height. So if the height is twice as tall, the power is twice squared, or 4 times as tall. So waves have this natural self-amplifying effect. It's called constructive interference. And if you have many meditators, for example, radiating an influence of peace, if there's something that's being radiated, if there's some kind of field of consciousness that extends beyond the brain, those waves will add up, and you'll see an influence of peace, for example, that grows as the square of loudspeakers, or in this case, the square of the number of meditators in a group. That's what we would expect. That's what the research I just showed you actually shows. The peace-promoting influence of groups of meditators grows as the square of the size of the group. So that fits the model of a field. But any self-respecting American is going to ask themselves, what field is this after all? There are 4 forces of nature. There are 4 known fundamental fields, and these include gravity, and gravity doesn't work. Gravity is not the field of consciousness. A gravitational influence is incredibly weak. It may surprise you, but the force of gravity is trillions and trillions of times weaker than any of the other forces. The only reason we feel it at all is that the Earth is so darn big that even with gravity as weak as it is, with an Earth that size, it's going to hold us down. Another force it could be is the nuclear force. That doesn't work as a field model of consciousness because the nuclear force is extremely short range. It is confined within the radius of the atomic nucleus. Similarly, the weak force, or radioactive force, is not only weak, but it is also confined within the radius of the nucleus. The electromagnetic force, that's a little bit of an option to consider. And a lot of people have considered it. And you might think that since our cell phones can be heard several miles away by the cell tower, perhaps the waves, electromagnetic waves that are within our brains can broadcast and be heard miles away. But if you do the numbers honestly, it just doesn't work that well. And that's fine, because when a surface description, a very classical explanation, doesn't work, it just forces us to look deeper. Deeper beneath the classical surface obvious world into the quantum mechanical world and the quantum field theory of elementary particles, even down to the level of the unified field, because the universe is structured in these layers of creation, superficial to profound, diversified surface to unified, transcendental. So if we look deeper, we can consider mechanisms of the Maharishi Effect, the spreading of social coherence, on all of these levels: classical, quantum mechanical, quantum field theory, unified field theory. And if we start with the classical, which we've already discussed briefly, there are various classical options, several classical options. There's how do we influence one another in a classical way? Well, there's fisticuffs. There's physical contact, which could be affectionate, or it could be not so affectionate. See that again. Wow. But unfortunately, physical contact only extends as far as we can reach. And even Muhammad Ali can't even reach across this table. So that's a very limited, it's not going to affect crime in or warfare in Lebanon. That we can abandon physical contact. That's not what's going on here. But there are other ways humans can communicate with each other classically. There's the spoken word. There's visual and olfactory communication. Spoken word, even with a megaphone, you can reach pretty far back, all the way across this room, probably not to the Middle East. There's communication, visual communication, a gesture at a soccer game or a traffic jam. There's communication through smell. But all of these classical forms of communication, really, you're hard pressed to figure out how that gesticulation here in Fairfield, Iowa, is going to have much of an impact in the Middle East. I mean, these methods, they don't cut it. So yes, we do have to look deeper, but we don't have to look very far. Even at the level of quantum mechanics, the physics of the atom, we find there already new mechanisms of long-range communication. Mechanisms that are being exploited in the laboratory today, the mechanisms that are darn strange and pretty spooky, as we'll see, but are being exploited in the laboratory today to do amazing things like quantum teleportation and long-range communication, quantum computing, quantum encryption. All these things are taking advantage of a very deep, rather mysterious quantum link, quantum means of communication. So let's understand this quantum mechanics thing a little bit, and that'll take us to our conclusion eventually, but we're not there yet. So there's physical nature, which exists on the left side here, and on many different levels of creation. There's the classical material, brick and mortar physics, there's the world of the atom, there's the world of the nuclear and subnuclear particles, and there's the unified field. We human beings are part of nature. We have structure, we have reality on all these same levels. We're part of nature, and we have a physical body. But there's also a quantum mechanical level of our existence, an atomic level, a nuclear level. There's a pure being level. We call these levels of human nature physical body, mind, fine feeling, and pure being. And these different levels of our human nature are governed by different laws. Physical body is governed by classical physics, Newtonian physics. Quantum mechanics is not. The mind is not governed by classical physics. It's governed by quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is really the mechanics of mind. Quantum field theory, finest level of mind, fine feeling, unified field theory, pure being, pure unity, pure universality. So given these different natures, levels of the human body, levels of human life, from outer physical to inner being, let's reconsider the range of our influence. What is the range of our human influence? Well, on the classical level, we said is very short. So if we look more deeply at a deeper level of human nature, let's look to the level of what is called mind. Mind is the world of quantum mechanics, and mind is governed by quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics has this remarkable feature of quantum entanglement, what Einstein called the spooky action at a distance nature of quantum behavior. The spooky action at a distance nature of quantum mechanics. That's called quantum entanglement. And we're going to utilize that today to understand how minds can connect at a distance, even beyond the reach of Muhammad Ali. So what is quantum entanglement? I'm going to give you two examples, and this is, going to go a little quickly. This is being recorded. If anybody wants to see this again, you can go back and see it again. I won't go too slowly because we don't have that much time, or you don't, I'm sure. So let's talk about quantum entanglement. And let me introduce the idea of a quantum mechanical particle. Like an electron is a quantum mechanical particle, which means it's not a tiny little grain of sand. The electron is described very differently in quantum mechanics. It's described by a wave function. A wave function is a spread out thing. Classically, a particle is a localized thing, but that's not true. That's Newtonian truth, but quantum mechanics describes a different reality. So in reality, the electron is a spread out thing, shaped perhaps like this, a wave function, and these wave functions can be spread out very far. That means here we are sitting in the laboratory. Brad Milet is over there behind the moon. And this electron and its wave function can be spreading all the way from the lab to behind the moon, even in the Crab Nebula. That's a weird thing. You might say, okay, but where is it really? It's really everywhere. At least it's everywhere within this wave function. The wave function doesn't necessarily go forever, but however big it is, that's where the electron is. But let's get real. Certainly it exists somewhere. Well, no, it doesn't. But if you look for it, you will eventually find it. And when you find it, it'll be somewhere. So let's introduce this very attractive observer, this eyeball, to look for the electron, to measure where the electron is. And sure enough, the electron will show up somewhere. It'll go from being which is provably unlocalized. It'll appear somewhere very localized upon measurement. So what happens on the measurement is this spread out wave function indicating that the electron is here, and it is here, and it is here, and it is here. It's a quantum coexistence of all places, all those locations. After the measurement, that wave function has localized it. We call that collapse of the wave function. It is localized to a single place. We've changed the electron by observing it. We've changed it profoundly from something that wants to be, is naturally unlocalized, to something that is very unnaturally localized. And it won't stay there for long. The moment you stop looking, boom, it'll spread out again. But the effect we've just had by performing our measurement right here in the laboratory and finding the electron, if we're so lucky, is that we suddenly know that it is not behind the moon. Why isn't it behind the moon? Because we just found it in the laboratory. So the wave function used to be spread out, shown on the top of the chart, but on the bottom of the chart, the wave function is now very localized. But that means we've had an instantaneous effect behind the moon. By performing an experiment right here, by localizing this delicious cup of Starbucks cream-filled coffee, right here in the laboratory, we know it's not behind the moon. So the wave function behind the moon of this electron has gone from non-zero to zero. And that kind of instantaneous effect behind the moon from here, faster than the speed of light, annoyed Einstein enormously. It upset him so profoundly, and there's good reason. It is upsetting for reasons we won't really dwell on. It's an amazing thing. He rejected quantum mechanics, which he helped create, and never really accepted it again. But quantum mechanics, in fact, is correct. Let's take a second example. Let us take a radioactive particle. Take your favorite radioactive particle, which I'm sure is the pion. Pions are radioactive, meaning they're not stable, they decay. They decay into a pair of photons, 2 particles of light. Voila. Our particle has decayed now into 2 particles of light, flying away from each other at, naturally, the speed of light. That's what pions do. They live for about 1/1,000,000th of a second. And then they do this. Now, this pion was a spinless particle. Some elementary particles are always spinning, others have no spin. This is a spinless particle, which means it's got spin 0. The photon has spin. It's a spinning particle. And it can either be spinning up, meaning spinning clockwise if you want to use your right hand, or it could be spinning counterclockwise or spinning down. It means the same thing. But so if one of these photons is spinning down on the right, the other one must be spinning up. Why? Because the total spin was 0. And spin, or angular momentum, is a conserved quantity in nature. So if you start out with 0 spin, you end up with total 0 spin. So these 2 photons have to be oppositely aligned. Now in quantum mechanics, the reality is a little bit stranger. The photon that gets created, let's look at the one on the right. The photon that gets created is neither up nor down. It is some quantum spooky coexistence of up and down. Well, spinning clockwise and spinning counterclockwise are classically incompatible. Quantum mechanically, though, that's the nature of quantum mechanics. It's neither this nor that, it's this and that. But along comes Betty Sue. And Betty Sue says, don't give me this and that mumbo jumbo. Get real. Is it spinning up or is it spinning down? I'm going to take a look. And if she does look, if she performs a measurement of the spin of this photon, this particle of light, she will discover that it is, well, either up, spinning up, or spinning downward. Either one is possible. I would say either one is actually equally possible. But because nature demands that the total spin of the 2 photons must always be 0 by conservation of spin, if she observes spin down, the other photon, which has now traveled perhaps way past the moon, well on its way to Mars, must be spin up, so the total spin will be 0. So when she observes the particle here in the laboratory and discovers it has spin down, or spin up, as the case may be, we're having an instantaneous effect across the universe on Mars. And again, Einstein found that, and most scientists find it, very troubling. Because the speed of light, for good reason, is considered to be the ultimate velocity. And something happens here, some kind of influence here seems to be happening fast in the speed of light. So he rejected it. And yet, this quantum entanglement is real. It is unbounded as well. It doesn't matter whether that second photon, that particle of light, has just passed the moon, is well past Mars, or is already in the Andromeda galaxy. The influence is unmitigated. So it is an unbounded effect, it does not fall off with distance. To have such an entanglement, to have such a long-range effect, these 2 particles had to have been connected in the past. They had to have interacted in the past. In this particular case, These two particles of light are actually, they share the same mother. They came from the same decaying pion. So yes, they are deeply connected, and therefore they are fully entangled. So practical questions, and then we'll apply this to human beings. You may wonder what this has to do with you. It has quite a bit to do with you. How do things become entangled? Well, by contact. The closer the contact, the more the entanglement. Let's consider a jar of water or a box of air. A jar of water is a collection of water molecules. A box of air is a collection of air molecules. These are very complex systems involving, millions times millions times millions times millions of molecules in some incredibly complex state of motion and bombardment. It's generally considered to be a big random, it is more or less an incredibly random kind of a dense chaos. However, if you have two shoe boxes full of air and you bring them into close contact so that the walls of the shoe boxes touch, every time an atom bangs against the wall of shoebox number 1, it creates a vibration on the wall of shoebox number 2, and that vibration gets communicated to the atoms that are in shoebox number 2. So there's a huge sharing of energy that takes place when these shoeboxes come into contact. And by this sharing of information, by this close interaction, they become entangled. They become correlated. They become synchronized. They're in sync with each other to some degree. And because of that, when they move apart from each other, their futures are and will remain linked. They will continue to exert this kind of spooky entanglement influence on each other, even at a distance. So close contact creates entanglement. Let's bring this closer to home. Are human beings entangled? When people come into contact, they share and exchange a huge amount of information, physically, mentally, verbally, emotionally, and they become entangled. And they carry that influence, they carry that memory with them. Interesting. People with whom we're very closely entangled, people with whom we interact very closely, our own spouse, for example, our children. When they go away from us, when they leave home, you carry their memory with them. They carry your memory with them. Wherever they are, you're really bound to them. You feel them very deep. It's subtle, but an unmistakable feeling. Sometimes a mother, for example, noticing her child has been away for a long time, will get a premonition. Uh-oh, I haven't heard from Joey for an hour now, and I have a bad feeling about it. And then the phone rings, and sure enough, there's a problem, there's an issue. That kind of premonition, that is not uncommon, that sense, is an example of not only carrying one's memory with you, but the long-range connection and communication that's contained in that entanglement. There's a subtle entanglement. Now, perhaps if you're, crude and intoxicated or whatever the case may be, or asleep, you won't feel that. But if you're alert and settled, you'll be very prone to noticing what is happening to an intimately connected friend. Quantum entanglements among human beings depends on the frequency and the intimacy of contact and the strength of their cultural bonds. For example, do these two groups attending two different sporting events, do they share a common language? Do they watch the same media outlets? Do they follow the same news stories? Do they interact frequently and intimately? Are they genetically resonant? Are they genetically related? The answer is, in this case, well, no, not really. So the long-range entanglements in the inevitable influence of an event in one country versus another country on another country depends on how intimately those countries are connected. What about these two countries? Do they share a common language? Mostly. Do they watch the same media outlets, follow the same news? Unfortunately for the Canadians, yes. Do they interact frequently and intimately? Fairly much so. Are the groups genetically related? Well, to some degree, yes. So they are maximally entangled, and they're subject to long-range influences. So let us go back to this Maharishi Effect. Let's take a look at the experiment conducted here on this beautiful campus. I wish I had some pictures of the campus to show you. It's looking absolutely spectacular, thanks to many of you. And I know I'm talking today to supporters and friends of the university. Thank you very much for that support. And I'm going a little quickly through things that I would have to take more time to explain if I were talking to people who weren't already familiar with this. And I'll be moving on, I think, in a moment to stuff that is really probably quite new to all of you. So we had this incredible experiment taking place with large numbers in our golden domes here between those years. And during those years, the number of people who were doing their meditation program, their TM-Sidhi program, their yogic flying program together jumped from before the experiment to maybe 500 to close to 2,000 once the experiment began. And since the effect of a group meditating grows as the square of the number of the group, that increase by a factor of 4 was a huge increase, maybe a 15 to 20-fold increase in the power of their collective effect. For that reason, pardon me, crime, as I mentioned before, started to drop in a highly statistically significant way. When the group was essentially disbanded, when funding for that group dried up due to economic circumstances of a granting organization, the numbers dropped immediately, and the crime statistics started to return to their historically high levels. It's a very significant effect. When this crime started dropping, it really made the news. During these 4 years, there were headlines like this: major cities plummeting crime rates, mystifying. This is the Washington Post. Violent crime has plummeted in major cities across the country, a trend criminologists describe as baffling and unexpected. Experts did not see this coming at all, said such and such, criminal justice of New York. Criminologists have different theories about why crime is down so much, although most now agree that the long-held belief that crime is connected to the economy and to poverty is false. Really? It's a long-held belief. It's not an unreasonable belief, but look at the data. During this continuous drop in crime, the large number of meditators were present. This was during the so-called Great Recession, which really hit strongly in 2008. Despite that, crime rates continued to drop. This country remained remarkably calm and remarkably coherent. Once the group disbanded, as you can see later on, though, then crime started to rise again. Now, this is very interesting. This chart measures the strength of the effect of this coherence-creating group on America and neighboring Canada and Mexico. And even in the country, this big group was located in Fairfield, Iowa, in the Midwest, shown at the center of this diagram. And as you stretch all the way to New York City or all the way to Los Angeles, the effect was less, but still highly statistically significant. When you cross the border into Canada, the effect was significantly less, but still statistically significant. But whatever happened to poor Mexico? There really seemed to almost be a barrier at the border. And this is before Trump's wall existed, if it exists even today. Somehow, this was not, the influence of coherence was not really having a big effect on the lives of everyday Mexican citizens. Well, quantum entanglements are strong among human beings depending upon the frequency and intimacy of their interactions and the strength of their cultural bonds. Do they share the same language? Do they watch the same news outlets? Do they follow the same news stories? Do they share common genetic link? And the answer in the case of Mexico is no, not really. It's right across the border, but it really is its own cultural world. So this is an interesting phenomenon. It shows that the long-range effect of group meditation on reducing crime and social violence isn't a strictly distance-related effect. Like a light bulb gets weaker and weaker and weaker proportionally to the square of the distance. It's a strictly distance effect, but this is different. This is more of a cultural effect, and we have to understand that, but we do. If it has to do with quantum entanglement, it's not the distance. Distance is irrelevant. It's the strength of the cultural links. So let's go back and summarize now. The range of influence, if we look at the human being as a physical body and even a physical brain, is very limited by the physical boundaries of the human body. But on the level of mind, excuse me, being governed by quantum mechanics, the possibility of long-range interactions is possible, even at an infinite distance. But the question that comes up when we use quantum entanglement to explain long-range interactions between people, that a scientist or most scientists will think to ask, is a very good question with a very remarkable answer. The question that a scientist traditionally asks about this explanation is, can quantum entanglements between people endure? Can they sustain themselves? Well, why wouldn't they sustain themselves? Well, quantum entanglements and quantum correlations typically don't last. And the reason is we, our physical bodies, are bombarded by our environment. Here we have a room filled with air and even more air. So whatever nice coherent relationships our atoms have, our physical atoms have with our spouse and their physical atoms, which would be resonating in synchrony but at a distance, those physical vibrations of our physical atoms are being constantly disrupted and constantly scattered by our environment. So any nicely preserved correlations between ourselves and our loved ones are going to become very quickly weak when it comes to the physical body and its physical vibrations. So the quick answer to, can quantum entanglements sustain themselves on the bodily level, is probably not. And the problem is, we can't insulate the body from its environment. Unless we live in a perfect vacuum and we can separate ourselves from cosmic rays and everything else that could possibly be disturbing us, which is frankly not possible. But what about on the level of the mind? If we can't insulate the body, can we insulate the mind? Because it's our mind. We have a body, but we live in our mind and we live in our hearts. We live on a deeper level. Is that level of us deep inside insulated somewhat from our outer physical environment? Can we insulate the body? Is the key question. Now, to answer this key question, we have to go in a very interesting direction. Because if all there is to us is a physical body, physically, if that's all we are is a physical body, and the mind is just a byproduct of the physical body, we can't insulate the mind because the mind is just the body. But is the mind more than the body? Is it different than the body? The answer is almost definitely, I would say definitely, yes. The mind has its own physiology, has its own subtler level of the physiology. We have gross physiology, of course, governed by gross Newtonian laws of classical physics, but we also have a quantum mechanical body and quantum field theory, a nuclear body. and a unified field theory level of pure being. And the mind has its own, therefore, subtler level of the physiology. And that subtler level of the physiology that corresponds with mind is often classically called, the subtle body, or in different traditions, thought body, astral body, etc. But if there is a subtler vehicle called mind, something that maybe even outlives the physical body, the question for a scientist now becomes, well, what in the world is it made of? If it's real, if it exists, it has to be made of something. But that something is not normal matter. If it were normal matter, for one thing, the Maharishi Effect wouldn't work. At least this mechanism of quantum coherence wouldn't work, because the physical body is getting bombarded by the environment. And any correlations that exist between me and my friend Brad over here would not survive. What could the subtle body be made of if it's not made of normal matter? How about abnormal matter? How about what is called dark matter? Dark matter, 85% of the matter of the universe, 85% of the mass of the universe is made of dark matter. And one of the key goals of science today is understanding what the heck it is. What is it made of? It's not made of atoms. It's not made of protons. It's not made of neutrons. It's not made of what we call light. If it exists, it's made of something else. Why not the dark matter that we know exists and that governs our galaxy, for example, and fills the universe? Dark matter governs the motion of stars in our galaxy. I like that effect. You can't see dark matter, it's invisible, but you know it's there as a huge spherical halo, because its gravitating effect dominates the behavior of the stars in our galaxy as they orbit the galaxy. The stars in our galaxy orbit the galaxy much faster than they would if all there was to our galaxy was the visible mass in the form of visible stars. Something in our galaxy, something else exists, and that something else is much heavier, is much more massive, much more plentiful than what we call normal matter. That's called galactic dark matter, or the galactic halo. In 1984, I wrote a paper which quickly became the standard model or leading theory of dark matter. And those are called WIMPs, or supersymmetric relics from the Big Bang, was the name of the paper. But it provided a candidate which continues to be the most common and popular candidate for what dark matter is: supersymmetric particles. And I'm not going to go in detail into what those are, because there's a new finding just a year or two old that changes my theory in the following important way. These supersymmetric relics from the Big Bang, these supersymmetric particles that we believed were the dark matter that fills the galaxy and fills the universe, turn out to be unstable in string theory. Excuse me. In string theory, these supersymmetric particles, shown in red, decay relatively quickly after maybe 1 million years. And that's quick on the scale of the universe. They decay into something else. They decay into what is called hidden sector matter, or in this case, hidden sector dark matter. Because whatever hidden sector matter was there before, whatever dark matter was there before in the form of supersymmetric particles has now become something else called hidden sector dark matter. And I won't even talk a lot about what hidden sector matter is or why it is and where it comes from, but it comes from string theory. String theory, today's unified field theory, theory of everything, most successful unified theory by far in the history of science. According to string theory, these supersymmetric particles, yesterday's dark matter, become today's dark matter, which is called hidden sector matter. And these hidden sector particles, or this hidden sector matter, is electrically charged. Like an electron is electrically charged, like a proton is electrically charged. These hidden sector particles have an electric charge, but they have a very small one. The electric charge of one of these new particles, these new dark matter particles, is about 1/1,000,000th of the electric charge of an electron or a proton. And that's this, it is emerging now as the leading theory of dark matter. I'll talk a little bit more about that, not much. So here we have the idea of a subtle body made of not yesterday's dark matter, which is long gone, not supersymmetric dark matter, but hidden sector matter. It's also called in the literature shadow matter, if you come across it, because you can't really see it, maybe vaguely, maybe dimly, but because it's so weakly electrically charged, it's called microelectrically charged, it's difficult to see. It's very cold, it's very easy to calculate that the temperature of this matter that surrounds us and goes through us and shrouds the earth is just a degree or two above absolute zero, which means this matter is probably superfluid. As I said, it's microelectrically charged, but because it's electrically charged, this is important, it clings to us. It clings to us electrostatically like Glad wrap clings to our hands electrostatically. You can take it off, you can remove it, but it wants to fly back and stick to your hand. Very annoying. Like that, this hidden sector matter that might compose our subtle body, our thought body, is, if it exists and we have any way of understanding it, it's made of this stuff. And it interacts with us relatively weakly, but it interacts with us. And it interacts very readily with itself. It interacts very strongly with itself, forming stable objects and stable bodies. This is a very different type of dark matter. Old-fashioned dark matter was dead. It just flies, it only interacts gravitationally. It's so weakly interacting. It just continues to fly back and forth through the galaxy. Maybe every 1,000,000 years it swings back. Just due to gravity, it all stays together. But other than that, it doesn't interact at all because it has no electric charge and it's impossible to see. In contrast, this is what hidden sector dark matter looks like. This microcharged dark matter looks like. It's a living body. It's a living self-interacting substance that collects around us and collects around the earth, is electrically charged, out of which bodies and so forth can be made. Oops. So let's come back to this. So if the mind has its own subtle vehicle, its own subtle body, it would be made of subtle material. According to science, there's very little options for what that can be. The most logical option is the option that we know about, which would be super cold, microcharged dark matter. And now we'll return to the question, and we'll soon sum up. Going back to the question, can quantum entanglements between minds, between subtle bodies, sustain themselves, even if entanglements among physical bodies probably cannot? Well, look at this, remember, this subtle body, this level of nature is super cold. It's super fluid. It sustains correlations. Cold is important. If you want to preserve orderliness, if you want to preserve correlation, if you want to preserve coherence, cool it, cool something, put it in the refrigerator. Putting food in a refrigerator keeps it fresh. It keeps the coherence from falling apart into chaos. It keeps the food orderly, keeps it from decaying. It keeps a quantum computer quantum. For a quantum computer to exist and to work, it has to be near absolute zero. Otherwise, thermal effects, similarly, will bombard it and will destroy all of its quantum correlations. So cold is the key to sustaining quantum correlations in this thought body or subtle body is ghostly cold. And because of that, can quantum entanglements sustain themselves? Yes. And this really is a huge mystery that has been solved with this theory, because it's the inability to sustain quantum correlations that would cause most physical scientists to feel that this Maharishi effect or long-range entanglements are not possible. All right, how can we verify this experimentally? Well, for one thing we can do, and we're working on the theory of it, and others are working on the experimental side of it, is we can discover these dark matter particles in the laboratory and explore their properties. We're very grateful here at the university to have grant support from the Emerald Gate Foundation. This work is in progress, involving these collaborators. So we can experimentally observe and determine whether these dark matter particles are in fact microcharged, super cold, whether they electrostatically cling to us, cling to normal matter, and have all the properties that we think they have, that theoretically they should have. And if they do have, that would actually be a very viable material for our subtle body, for our thought body. And while we're on the subject of subtle bodies, we could ask ourselves, what besides the Maharishi effect are they good for? Who wants one? What would you pay for a subtle body if you had to purchase one on Amazon? Well, for one thing, it thinks. That's a very good thing to be able to do. And where our human brains are very capable of certain types of computations because they've got gates, they have logic chips, logic circuits, they have memory. That's fine for doing mathematical calculations that probably you wouldn't do on a finer feeling level, a more abstract conceptual level. But the mind is more than just a set of gates and memory gates and logic chips. The mind has the ability to think abstractly. The mind and feeling have the ability to think on a very abstract, huge, and rarefied level. The level of mathematics really transcends computers. Computers really haven't been able to do mathematics since quantum mechanics came around. Because quantum mechanics, quantum field theory, they use a different type of math. It's all symbolic. It's not numbers. So the human mind, however, unlike a calculator, can deal with this sort of symbolic logic. So the mind brings something that the brain doesn't have. It brings the ability to think abstractly, in cooperation with the brain, in collaboration with the brain. So it thinks, what else is good? What else would you purchase a subtle body for? Why would you want to have one? Well, it's good to be able to think abstractly. It also has the advantage of it survives. Survives what? It survives the most unpleasant of circumstances. So if the physical body runs out of juice and basically passes away, which it inevitably does, there's no much controversy about that, the question would be, what happens next? Well, what happens next, at least what you'd think from the standpoint of the physics of a self-contained, self-sustaining subtle body, is the subtle body would survive. And now, what happens next, I'm simply going to quote, I have no memory of this. I can't hardly remember what I had for dinner last night. I have no, immediate memory of this. I certainly have a strong sense for it. But there's a beautiful talk Maharishi Mahesh Yogi gave, captured on audio to advanced meditators one day, when he talked about the different levels of the human body, the subtle body, the causal body, which is kind of like our individualized soul. It's subtler than the mind. It's kind of the very nature of our individual ego. And what he described is this: the subtle body has its own integrity, but it is not immortal. Over time, this subtle body will start to run out of gas, juice basically, and it'll start to dissipate and start to diffuse. And essentially, basically, it'll start to kind of vanish into the ether. And that may take time. It depends upon how developed and how mature and how strong our thought body is. Some people, you wonder whether they can think at all. But people have well-developed emotional and mental life. Now, if you're a bodybuilder and that's all you do, you're going to have a well-developed physical body. You're going to have muscles like Schwarzenegger, and you can be very proud of that. And if you ever pass away, it'll be a huge loss because your entire identity and your pride is all in your muscles. If instead you really are living your life, and most people are, more on the level of feeling and the level of knowledge and knowing, the physical body's less important. when you lose it, it's not a traumatic event, it's just a change, a significant change. But that mind won't last forever. What happens eventually is it runs out of its momentum and then basically fades away. What happens next in Maharishi's description is that the causal body, the individualized abstract soul, so to speak, individualized jiva, which basically holds our fine intellect, it holds our level of consciousness, it holds the essence of us, that will, excuse me, draw basically, what happens basically after a while is that a new birth is taken. A new physical body is born. And that physical body doesn't really have yet much of what we would call a mind. That physical body is new, and the brain is just like an empty slate. And over the course of one's childhood, the mind, the brain gains the ability to focus the senses and recognize the face of its mother and of the environment. And over the course of one's childhood, you get more and more competent, the brain develops, and you start to really develop a mind. So over the course of adolescence and adulthood, you really develop what is a mature and stable mind, independent of the physical body, but that operates in conjunction with the physical brain. So that's kind of the cycle. And the subtle body, therefore, has a number of advantages, including its ability to think and its ability to survive. So I'm going to conclude and see what we have for questions, and just take a little bit of that. First conclusion, there are physically viable mechanisms for the spreading of social coherence that we call the Maharishi Effect, for reducing social violence, reducing social stress, promoting social harmony, promoting societal peace. These mechanisms involve long-range human interactions, obviously. And those long-range human interactions are found not so much on the classical level where our reach is defined by our reach, physical reach, but at deeper levels, the level of quantum mechanics and ultimately quantum field theory. And unified field theory is the level at which we are all one. At that point, there's no separation. To the degree we are functioning at that level of being, and we splash on that level, we merge with that level, we submerge in that level, at least briefly, during virtually every meditation. So these deeper levels of quantum mechanics, quantum field theory, unified field, deeper levels of our mind, feeling, and pure being, on these levels, we are more and more intimately connected. We've seen on the level of quantum mechanics we're connected. On the level of being, there was never any separation to begin with. So these mechanisms involve A, quantum entanglement, and the long-range phenomenon, the long-range collapse of the quantum wave function, and B, a very important adjunct to explanation A, is that the existence of a dark matter or subtle body or thought body would help sustain long-range quantum entanglements over long periods of time, making it a much more viable explanation. Interestingly, this is my last statement, these above mechanisms conform to Maharishi's own description of the Maharishi Effect as a, quote, field effect beyond space and time. A normal field travels within space and time. Electromagnetic waves travel within space and time, and they get weaker with distance. These field effects seem to transcend distance, and the explanations above also transcend distance. And this mechanism also accounts for key features of the Maharishi Effect research, which include the dependence upon cultural, not just geographic proximity. In fact, cultural proximity and cultural entanglement is more important, according to the data, than geographic proximity. And the Yoga Sutras themselves that predicted this phenomenon say, in the vicinity of yoga, in the vicinity of the experience of pure consciousness. In the vicinity of transcendental experience, hostile tendencies are eliminated. And most of all, I wanted to thank all of you on this call for being a part of this great solution. Whether you're in the domes or in your homes, whether you're in Newark, New Jersey, or in Fairfield, Iowa, or wherever you are, you're all contributing to the positivity, to the sattva, to the coherence of the world. And I truly thank you for that. 10 minutes longer than promised. Let's see if we have a couple questions before I let you go. Go ahead, Brad, speak up because the mic is here.
Have there been any breakthrough in mainstream science or acceptance or appreciation of the Maharishi Effect research?
Oh gosh, since the very first studies created its enormous initial controversy and interest, I would say, with the publication in the Yale Journal of Conflict Resolution of this Israel study, where we showed in a highly statistically significant way the correlation between the number of people participating in a meditating group in Israel and the reduction of war violence in the surrounding area. Those editors of that prestigious journal published the article in their words because they had to, because the quality of the research, because the statistical significance of the result, statistical confidence in the reality of the result was so strong, they certainly could not reject the article. But they encouraged other groups to go out and repeat it. This is so hard to imagine that a group of 1,000 people could affect the influence of 1 million, affect the behavior of 1 million. They urged other groups to go out and replicate the study. And as I showed you, over the next 2.25 years, there were 7 replications of that study by different groups, all published, and all showing the same remarkable effect. Now that was a huge boost, and that and this national demonstration project in Washington, D.C., with the whole press involved, and every member of the Washington, D.C. City Council was on the scientific advisory board of that study. So this made huge waves in the press. It's been cited many thousands and thousands of times in subsequent articles. So certainly sociologists know, psychologists many, criminologists know about the Maharishi Effect. And so people who are interested in this field and have bothered to read about it, feel very strongly about it, have a great deal of confidence in it. And it's the sort of thing that I think people are just starting to get. And younger people somehow naturally, automatically get it. Perhaps they're not as deeply schooled in the pre-quantum mechanical materialist worldview for it to seem so strange. It seems more natural to younger generation. So yes, there's been a lot of progress there. And what's slowing it down a little bit is the absence of a clearly understood mechanism. That's what we're trying to address today. Remember, the Journal of the American Medical Association and medical doctors themselves were continuing to recommend smoking for decades after the scientific correlation between smoking and lung cancer had been established. Why would they recommend smoking if the data showed that it causes lung cancer? Because the mechanism wasn't understood, the mechanism. And if a mechanistic person like a medical doctor or a physicist can't understand the mechanism, they tend to dismiss the whole thing as a fluke. They tend to dismiss the data. So even though the data is firm, and people who care about the data, which all scientists are supposed to, are likely to believe it, there's plenty of scientists who would wave it off as saying, but that's not possible. So to have the mechanism is important, and this research with the Emerald Gate Foundation is important because it's allowing us to now really pin down the details of these mechanisms. And so that is work in progress, and I'm very excited about that.
Does observing the electron, does it literally localize the electron, or does it just appear to be localized to the observer?
To measure or observe the position of an electron, you have to localize it. And if you've localized it, there it is. And so you might say, well, then it's nowhere else. So somehow measuring it localizes it. And you could say that's a reality. And that's the way quantum mechanics is commonly understood. For those of you with a stomach for it, I'm going to give another talk a week from today. It's called Universal Mind and the Non-Collapse of the Wave Function. And in that talk, I will attempt to unravel what has certainly been a huge enigma thus far. And that is, does the wave function actually collapse, or has Brad has just asked in this question, whoever asked the question, it's a brilliant question, does it really? And the answer to that is so extraordinary. What seems to be the answer to that is so extraordinary, it is almost upsetting, because it is such an enormous concept, not upsetting, but it's dizzying. It is rather spellbinding and so astonishing that you should bring smelling salts to next week's talk. So that's deep, and that's going to be the subject of next week, and it's going to be a lot of fun, I believe. Yeah.
Many people were asking about the cultural influence of Latinos in the United States. They comprise 17% of the population.
Yes, yep. Okay, well, anyway, the United States now is a mixed culture. And certainly, and Latinos, especially Latinos who've been in the country and have understood, become fluent in English and are interacting with others, not just physically, but verbally and emotionally. We're all one tightly, entangled society. So within the United States, it's sometimes called a melting pot. It really is a melting pot in a quantum mechanical sense as well. We're all entangled, and more we're becoming one family. And there are holdouts, believe me, there are people who have strong racial biases. But as a whole, we're becoming one rich and integrated family. So, in the extent that we have a Latino component in this mix, their family ties and cultural ties, for example, with Mexico, assuming they exist, in many cases they do, that's going to melt the border between the US and Mexico. We're going to be more and more one family, feel as one family, be one family. And at that point, meditation that is done here in the US will have an effect in Mexico. And what I'm hoping is the huge meditation groups that are being founded in Mexico and areas of Mexico where large schools by the hundreds are all practicing their daily collective meditation, not the cities, in many cases, even the cities program. Then we'll start to be the beneficiary of Mexican coherence, which is probably on the rise more than our own coherence in the United States right now. So it'll benefit us both, and I'm looking forward to that. And last question, I should make an announcement or two. Go ahead.
Does the online group meditation that we have now, does that create the Maharishi Effect as well?
Yes. Synchronized meditation, whether from a distance or up close, is going to be thrilling that same universal field of consciousness, the level at which we are all one, all of us, meditators, non-meditators, Latinos, non-Latinos, all cultures. On that level, we are all one. If we're synchronized in our meditation, we're going to have that n-squared effect. There isn't as much research done on that as of this point. Most of the research published has been on large groups that were of a relatively localized nature, like in Washington, D.C., or here in our domes. We're pretty confident, though, that the influence of collective meditation from a distance will be, if not 100% as strong, still strong. And many people out there are meditating in a synchronized way during this pandemic, since they really can't gather in groups. I'm really glad for that. I appreciate everybody who's organizing their life to do so and sync up with our meditations here in the domes and with others across the country. So yes, it'll have a big effect. Can't say on the basis of experiment that is exactly as strong an effect, but I'm confident that it is a strong effect. Let me close by saying a few things. On this call, we have, in my mind, really great heroes of Transcendental Meditation, and certainly great heroes of this university. You have been collectively as a group supporting this university since its founding. Many of you have lived here, have worked here, or still do, or have been giving to the university for a long, long time. The university is in the midst of its best trends in the history of the university. We are looking forward to the largest entering class in this coming fall, by far than at any time in the university's history. We're having a colossal increase in the number of people joining our programs in Maharishi Ayurveda and aromatherapy soon, just starting, and Maharishi's Vedic Science of Consciousness, Consciousness and Human Potential. We've got a huge growing population of online students, soon to surpass the number of students we have on campus. So it's a very exciting time, but it's also a very challenging time. And I've never seen a time of such excitement and such potential and such challenge. What's causing the challenge? Well, the good news is we are operating. We're one of the few schools in Iowa that have managed to operate and operate safely. We've had no COVID-19, no coronavirus incidents on campus at all. There've only been a very few in the entire county. We're practicing very, very safe standards, and we'll continue to do so. And we are planning to be back in session in the classroom, COVID-19 allowing, but planning to be back in the classroom in the fall. The downside has been the following. The economy is in a bit of shambles. We've got more unemployed right now than in the Great Depression. We don't know how long that's going to last. In the meantime, the university is graduating probably 2 or so per day, master's graduates in our computer science program. This is an incredible program. It's the second largest computer science professionals program in the world. Here at MIU, with about 500 students in it. And we offer that education for free. And the students basically pay once they get a job. And 98-point-something% of them get a job in a Fortune 100 company within a few months of graduating. And it's only when they get a job that the university gets paid and we can keep the lights on, we can feed the students and keep our university going. But getting those Compro students in hired, excellent as they are, really at the head of their field. They're highly sought after. But who's hiring right now? The tech companies, a little bit, but nothing like normal. So our Compro hires are down by roughly 2/3. And that means that the cash on which the university operates is down by about 2/3. That's not a situation that you can weather very easily. And we basically need help, and we're getting help to get us through to the fall in strong working shape. Some of the help is coming from the government. There have been some government grants for educations. There are some government loans. Most of the help has actually come from you. The donors, most of you, many of you on this call, have been very generous. We have an endowment matching challenge that was met. It was $1 million matching gift, and then $1 million in smaller gifts followed. And that gave us a $2 million boost in our endowment, which for us is a big boost. And that special fund within the endowment can be used in emergency as operating capital. So it's got a dual purpose. It's a permanent endowment, but the university can borrow from it and then repay it. And right now we're borrowing from it. There's another $500,000 in that same matching fund, which we're now trying to match with another $500,000, which will bring that up to $3 million. And that we're going to need. The other thing we're going to need is to make the annual fund. You've probably all recently gotten this in the mail, or many of you have. If not, we're going to send you an e-version of it right now, or today. You'll get another e-version of it if you haven't gotten it already. It's very short, but it's wonderful. And it really shows the remarkable things that are going on here and remarkable ways you can help. But this endowment matching challenge is one thing, and the annual fund is the other. The annual fund funds the operations of the university. Now, tuition mostly funds the university, but the donations are also absolutely key. And right now, they're essential, critical, because we don't have the normal source of tuition money. That's been delayed by the coronavirus. Now it's really basically up to you. So please do take a look at that brochure, the e-brochure that is coming, and please help the university as generously as possible. This is the time Those of you who've been helping us for years and years, God bless you and thank you so very much. Those who have us in their wills, God bless you. Thank you very much. That's the long-term rock of Gibraltar of the university. But right now is when we absolutely need support. And I know that's hard for people because many people are experiencing the COVID blues, just as the university is. But the university, which by the way, just got an absolutely glowing report, unbelievable glowing report from the Department of Education's accrediting body, the HLC. We got a 10-year extension of our accreditation. We got the formal report yesterday, and it's absolutely phenomenal. The Higher Learning Commission, the accrediting body for the Midwest, loves us and loves what we're doing and sees nothing but huge success in the future of the university. That's great. The promise has never been anything like it is right now, but we need help in getting through the summer and into the fall, where the tuition revenues will start to flow again. And until we have a permanent endowment of significant size, these occasional depressions and recessions are always going to put a strain on the university. And this is such a time. So I really thank you for being with us today. Thank you for your kind questions. Thank you for your excellent questions and your very generous attention. And also thank you in advance for any help, certainly that you have given us, and any help you may be able to give us now. With fond wishes, Jay Gurudev, John.